I mentioned the last episode turning the series on its head, making Mob the villain of the final arc. Well, this episode decides to hold it there, complete with surprising origins of this being. Let's get recapping. Suzuki arrives on time to spare Koyama and Sakurai from further humiliation after they fail to protect their convenience store. Despite Suzuki's best efforts, it's an all too familiar scenario where the entity is just steamrolling through his opponents. Luckily, he's saved by his son Sho. Suzuki figures he might as well tank a shot from the entity to regain strength. This was an ability revealed in the second season.
I'm able to share my abilities with anyone I choose. At the same time, I can absorb other people's abilities as my own.
Seeing as this absolute beast is venting out large amounts of energy, the best strategy he can come up with is to keep it distracted long enough to tire itself out. While it appears they might have the upper hand, the entity takes a trick from Suzuki's playbook, absorbing a full blast from father and son. Disgruntled, Sho decides to leap back into action, unaware the entity is ready to catch him in the frenzy. However, Suzuki steps in to take the hit for his son. They both come to the frustrating conclusion that they're on the losing side of this battle. Fortunately, Mob attempts to regain control of his body, leaving an opening for Suzuki to absorb all of its energy as Mob had once done for him. Sho is resistant to the idea as this will likely end in his father's death, though Suzuki seems resolved to make this sacrifice, until he hears his son call out for him. Overcome by the emotions brought about by contemplating over his family, he is swayed to take this opportunity to flee with Sho. The Body Improvement Club finds Mob in order to bring him back to the shelter, however the entity blasts an air attack at them. As a result, they correctly deduce their friend's plight.
The only possible explanation is that Kageyama's in some kind of sleepwalking state.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's up to us as his fellow club members to snap him out of it.
Unfortunately, they aren't effective in combat in the least. Sagawa, being the only one left standing, admits they've always looked up to Mob, begging for him to return to normal. Sadly, this isn't enough for Mob to regain control entirely. The entity throws Sagawa, leaving him to break his neck on the bridge. During these events, Ritsu sensed Mob's powers. Assuming his brother lost control of himself after being rejected, he picks up on Mob's trail, worried that his brother may have been injured. He recalls a time when Mob used to be open with his emotions, but everything changed when he decided to conceal his powers. Ritsu believes that caused the birth of this creature. During this time, he recovers Teru and learns of his brother's immediate location, arriving on time to save Sagawa. While Ritsu had always feared his brother, he realizes that this form of Mob isn't going away, and it isn't a separate entity from his brother either. Mob cannot hold himself back from attacking. The duel between brothers begins. Ritsu is immediately restrained as Mob comes stalking forward. During this time, we see the percentage ticking up. Ritsu is resigned to his fate, hoping his sacrifice will awaken his brother. However, Ritsu quickly changes his mind considering the psychological damage he would inflict on his brother, deciding to stop him, gaining access to 100% of his power, knocking back his brother and restraining him. Enraged, Mob blasts Ritsu into the sky, yet leaving him unharmed. Mob finds something within his consciousness, questioning what it is and what it wants. It introduces itself as Shigeo Kageyama, and has no intention of going anywhere. In fact, it confesses its endgame is to switch places with Mob, leaving him trapped here. The news mentions a tornado has now formed with no logical explanation. It's now Reigen and Serizawa's turn to enter the fray. Now, I did mention that I didn't like Suzuki's odds in this fight, but it's not as if we had a wealth of other options. He's perhaps the most powerful Esper Mob has ever fought. I mean, he's the only one to do this to the strongest version of Mob. To his credit, Suzuki comes up with a strategy to fend it off, but it just didn't work out. And for what it's worth, I'm not confident that Suzuki would have been able to complete his sacrifice to absorb Mob's energy entirely. We've seen Suzuki fail to control 100% of his own power already. But on to the finer details, Suzuki is clearly attempting to be a more dutiful and protective father. He first absorbs an attack that in all likelihood would have hit Sho. Just look at the size of it. We've already seen Koyama and Sakurai get caught in a similar blast. Moments later, it's more obvious when Sho jumps face first into an attack and his father shields him. Throughout the fight, we see them working well together, complete with their own twisted version of a father-son Kamehameha. Well, more like a Rasengan, but you get the point. Either way, it's a big deal considering the amount of abuse he hurled at Sho the last time they met. There are also 2 seasons worth of reasons for the viewers not to be a big fan of his either.
We're being held here against our will! Please, step aside and let us go!
Come on, guys. That's a crime and you know it.
We're very sorry, sir!
Certainly difficult to get redemption out of such a villainous character. Yet this was set up at the end of his last battle, stating all his regrets and showing kindness to Serizawa.
People need other people.
Back to their battle, at the moment when Mob was struggling to control himself, Suzuki likely attempted to take the most effective and virtuous action he could think of by choosing to die. However, the show equates that to him walking away from his family. Now, this is an interesting decision because he would have likely been seen as a more redeemable character by the audience, especially if the show framed it as Suzuki protecting his family. Though instead, they decide to have him renounce his ambitions and be humbled by defeat.
When it comes down to it, I guess I'm simply not as strong as you are.
It can be implied that he still has a personal journey to take after the series is done to reconcile with his estranged wife. This is based on comparisons with the flashbacks and his conversations with Mob in the previous fight.
You wanted to apologize, didn't you? I need to tell someone how I feel about them too!
I wouldn't argue he'll be leaving the series a beloved character, but I would say he had meaningful growth while still maintaining his consistency with his rough exterior. This series hadn't lost sight of what this character is. A few examples of what I mean. Suzuki never explains himself to Sho after defending him, basically ignoring him. As well, no one else outside of his family gets this treatment. He doesn't care if Koyama or Sakurai get caught in the fight. He brutally knocks out others without an attempt to reason or restrain them at first. It's unclear how much he has a problem with Mob letting his powers go wild.
I thought you might be in a bad mood, but it looks like you're doing pretty well. Perhaps you've simply given up on holding back, which is not necessarily a bad thing to a point.
He doesn't once consider holding back against Mob despite him being a child.
This is not a situation where we can afford to be gentle.
Somehow I don't see that being a problem for you.
We can compare that with other characters who attempt to restrain him or destroy his objective. So the show doesn't try to completely change Suzuki's personality all the way to righteous hero as they had with Teru. I think it deserves some credit. Moving on to the poor body improvement club once again. They only wanted to get him to safety and are completely outmatched. Though I'm glad Sagawa is given a chance to speak. We already know how much Mob reveres the club, even using it as an inspiration in his fight with Suzuki.
Body improvement! Fight on!
Yet the audience is given a reminder of how much the club truly respects Mob, as they have throughout the series.
You've always been running right behind us. You never give up. Seeing you like that gives the rest of us courage.
The true Giga Chad gains were the ones we made along the way. Next on to Ritsu. We've been aware of the mixed emotions he's had towards his brother for a while now, both inferiority and fear. The feeling of envy he felt towards Mob had been resolved in the first season. However, his fear of Mob's other form had gone unaddressed. He felt strongly that this was not his brother. With time, he had come to realize that it's only an aspect of Mob and isn't going to simply dissipate after being ignored. Ritsu quite literally needs to face his fear. He had been ready to take the hit from Mob, but this episode and series have an anti-sacrifice theme running, so because Ritsu is able to persevere, this grants him access to 100% of his powers. My gut instinct was telling me this was the huge ass pull that I had been waiting for. But there are references to make this more reasonable, mostly revolving around Ritsu's arc in the first season. With Ritsu's first few successful attempts, as he starts to grow frustrated with his lack of progress, essentially he lets his emotions overwhelm him in order to develop his skills. The very opposite of what Mob was attempting to do. We then see Ritsu purposely put himself in heated situations to increase his strength. like when he commits underhanded tactics towards his classmates or when he used his powers against others. However, as I mentioned, Ritsu was scared of his brother. He even admitted he had been in denial of this thing's true nature after being honest with himself, realizing Mob was always in need of help. Combined with the love he has for his brother, this allowed him to reach 100%. Finally, this isn't a unique skill the brothers possess, to enter this state with the pure strength of emotions, as this happens with Suzuki, and it's directly stated that he gets stronger under pressure.
My dad's aura didn't disappear. He mentioned to me before, when he's under a lot of stress, that's when he's truly awakened.
With all that being said, my worries were still on high when Ritsu awakened his full powers, since I thought they were going to reveal he's the strongest Esper in the series at the 11th hour. Thank goodness that wasn't the case. Asspull averted. He is still strong enough to defend himself for a bit, but it's not as if he demonstrates anything that wasn't previously attempted by more powerful Espers. Though we can see the more Mob is confronted by his allies, the more his consciousness has a presence and is able to take hold of his body, even if for only a moment, so it's really great work there building that up. Now let's talk about Mob's shadow. I was calling it an entity for a bit, but certain revelations were made about the origins of this being. Ritsu theorizes that this shadow was born from his desire to hold back his powers by holding back his emotions. Now is a golden opportunity to speak about Mob's psyche. Take note that the shadow speaks about letting his impulses guide him.
If you don't like it, then you leave. I'm gonna do what I want.
Obviously, this is what Mob has been fighting against since before the series began, so you can only imagine how devastating this might feel for this character. In his effort to control this power, he ended up creating the monster he was afraid he would become. His shadow is a royal pain. Okay, I'll stop. Ultimately, Mob will need to accept this more impulsive side of himself and become whole again as he had when he was a child. Add to that, he had gotten close before the accident.
Lately, I've started noticing I don't hold back my feelings as much.
I'm not coming to this conclusion because I played the Persona series.
That thing isn't me!
I mean, they don't own Carl Jung's concept of the persona and shadow. No, we don't need any outside factors because Ritsu plainly states what the issues are and how it needs to be resolved.
It's a part of who he is deep down. It can't be separated from him. That means we have to figure out a way to live with it.
I think out of any character, he's clearly the most appropriate to know, obviously being brothers, though also his own personal journey to conquer his fear, his own personal shadow. He can recognize his brother needs help. It's up to Reagan to give Mob that push he needs to guide him in the right direction as he's done before, which would be a great way to wrap up that relationship and series. If there are any criticisms, I have to say to Sabomi, what are you doing? Even if it turns out she's madly in love with Mob, this is still insane and reckless. She's not an Esper, and that's a tornado. Hello, is there anybody inside there right now? Can't feel more like the finale to a series than bringing all our protagonists' friends and former enemies into the conflict, giving the chance to use their fight to point out or overcome inadequacies they felt about themselves. We have our God King of Imperfection joining us in the final episode, and hopefully enough time for an epilogue. They've done it with the last two seasons, why not this time, right? That's all for now.